Okay, so for the wrap up here, what I wanted to do is give a little bit of an overview of an on-again, off-again heat assessment project that actually started a few years back and realistically has been mostly done for a year or so now, but haven't had a good opportunity in presenting in the context of these other two presentations. Made sense to talk about what some of the things we learned from that assessment and how it's feeding into a few of the CLIMAS projects going forward in the new proposal and some other stuff that's developing. So in the talk today, give a quick overview, a very brief overview, because I feel like this has already been covered, of how we're thinking about heat in the Southwest. Mainly focus a little bit on the CLIMAS heat assessment framework that we used. Kind of what some of the challenges we identified, what a few conclusions might be, and lessons learned. And then the most important part for moving forward is thinking about how this connects to a few project examples and how this has either helped inform some of those projects or how those projects were informed by this assessment process. So first, the brief overview of heat in the Southwest. Don't need to belabor this because we've already covered it pretty well. We know that the duration and intensity of heat is increasing. We know increasing temps overall, broad projections for increased heat waves as well. So again, to get to the meat of it, I'm just going to kind of quickly go over this. We also know timing and duration of the hot season is increasing. So we're going to have more warm days. We're going to have longer summers. We're going to have warmer temperatures during those summers. Again, heat in the Southwest is something, as Andrew actually pointed out, that it connects to this talk. It's something we're kind of accustomed to. And so while these projections can be a little alarming, our system is actually relatively well designed, and I emphasize relatively well designed to anticipate or deal with some of those heat-related exposures, especially when you don't talk about some of the very high extremes that Greg mentioned. Okay, so one reason why this is concerning, and again, also links to what Andrew was talking about, is this, this concern over heat wave disasters. And so we had a few examples, Chicago and Europe. I think I have the attributed deaths a little high for the Europe. It depends on which source you look at. But broadly speaking, these extreme heat events were linked to large urban areas in some cases, extreme heat and humidity, and that humidity is an important piece, and really focused a lot on how it affected at-risk populations, and in some cases, lack of access to cooling systems or perhaps the resources to run some of those cooling systems in dense urban environments or in widespread areas of Europe are kind of the two key examples. Again, thinking about vulnerability in this context, it's going to be a little different for the Southwest because this was unexpected heat affecting people who maybe weren't necessarily positioned to grapple with it versus the Southwest where we have a lot of systems in place. Okay, so the CLIMAS heat assessment framework is grappling with this large idea of how to think about extreme heat and cascading effects, but we pretty early on pivoted to think more about persistent vulnerability and some of the network of related impacts. Things like NIHIS are actually well situated to grapple with extreme heat, and so we thought about what's the CLIMAS approach, or what are some of the things we can think through that have a longer trajectory of how heat-related vulnerability has some relevance or salience within the context of climate in the Southwest and what that might mean we would do going forward. In terms of methods, there's a lot of information and data gathering about some of the challenges and realities of heat in the Southwest. We conducted a number of interviews with some of the regional stakeholders and decision makers who think about some of these issues, and then thought about what's the synthesis of some of the key themes, and then the research needs and gaps that come out of this discussion. And some of the goals of this assessment were to identify these heat-related risks, especially this intersection between extreme events and accumulated vulnerability, to maybe highlight some of the unique characteristics of the Southwest, how we think about vulnerability a little differently because we have a relatively extreme climate compared to some of the other locations that have grappled with heat waves or extreme heat, to assess some of the policies and practice that are in place that address heat risk, and then primarily then to wrap that up is to identify some areas for further research that really would help us think about some of these long-term perspectives on heat-related vulnerability. And again, a lot of this connects to some of the other work. So just a quick overview of a few of the results that came out of that assessment. One is this idea of the sort of normalcy of heat in the Southwest. And so I just have a quick quote here that I think illustrates it really nicely. This interviewee is, I think heat is an underestimated concern because we tend to think we can deal with heat. There's a certain amount of pride in the Southwest on dealing with hot days. What we don't realize is the number of days over 100 and the fact that low temperatures won't be going down as much will impact us more profoundly than if you just said, oh, we're going to have a hot day. And so it really emphasizes this idea that, if we're kind of treating heat as normal, when it changes or when we have extreme events, we may not be as well positioned to deal with it as we think. And part of that is linked to this long history we have in terms of the legacy of a built environment in the Southwest. We have pretty intensive investment in active cooling and climate control, so air conditioning, swamp coolers, sees pretty widespread use across, especially the warmer regions of the Southwest. We also have behavioral adaptations, not going out in the middle of the day, not hiking on the extreme days, maybe spending some more time indoors if we're able to. Also passive cooling. You see some of the shade policies that have been developed, or even just the way people build pergolas or covered patios to help mitigate some of the exposure that they might see. And then also some of the emergent ideas about infrastructural or technological adaptation. So this nice little overlap where you can build a shaded parking structure that also doubles as solar generation. So we have some strategies that have come out of, they're not explicitly, not solely isolated to the Southwest, but certainly things that we see as relatively consistent strategies in the Southwest of dealing with this extreme heat or sustained warm temperatures. But again, thinking back to how this can sometimes normalize heat risk. So heat and even extreme heat, but more just the gradual accumulation of that persistent, when in June you start to feel kind of bummed out because you know that, man, it's coming. It's characterized as normal though. This is something we think about as an expected part of the Southwest. And the built environment is really a ubiquitous aspect of this. So in order to be here in this extreme environment, there have been these considerable investments in infrastructure, cooling technology, to basically facilitate safety and comfort. And it's made more notable in its absence. So in a power outage, it becomes very clear how much it matters that we don't have our cooling systems running. And so if heat risk is normalized in the Southwest, this can set the stage for crises in the event of a system failure. So we think about the cascading effects or the high impact, low probability workshop that discussed some of these issues. What could happen if something went wrong and how those problems might cascade through the system highlights one of the larger risks because of our large investment in these technologies that mitigate exposure to heat. And then if we think about resilience and vulnerability moving forward as a function of access, and not just as this, but one way that we were thinking about with the assessment project, as a function of access. So do you have access to these interventions? Do you have the ability to pay your monthly cooling bill? And then exposure to other heat and hazards moving forward. So a disaster in this context. Obviously, there's some pretty clear examples of direct exposure in extreme heat, especially if you lack access to cooling technology or the resources to run the cooling technology. As we move down the time scale a little bit, you can think about an acute system failure as the electrical grid goes down, cascading effects of blackouts. But we can also start to think a little bit more about gradual system failure, or maybe just system instability. Maybe it's not even failing. So the underlying context, maybe there's the changing climate. We know that it's getting warmer. We have this relative dependence on a built environment in order to mitigate these effects. And then if we think about that dependence, we can also start to raise the question of inequality in access. It's not just the technologies are required to be here, they also require money to run, power bills, electric utilities, that sort of thing. And so this failure, again, maybe instability more than failure of infrastructure and built environment, but also the role of social inequalities or unintended outcomes of planning and policies, and thinking through on different timescales what this heat-related vulnerability looks like. And again, back to disaster and persistent vulnerability, another quote that came out of the assessment was this idea of, I think people are not prepared to deal with disasters, heat disasters. A heat disaster would be an extreme heat event where we lose our ability to live as we normally live, or with air conditioning, or refrigeration, or communication systems, or water. Because all of those things would be unavailable if the grid goes down, and that's the kind of extreme heat event that happened in California and can happen here. I believe this was referring to the outages that happened in San Diego, I think 2011, is that? Yeah, 2011. So this is the outage map from then. Relatively widespread in Southern California, but it did reach into the very edge of Arizona as well. And this is the sort of thing that drives some concern, again, with a relatively high impact event. There's planning and preparations in place, but with a large enough scale event, it's hard to imagine that you could be well prepared for a widespread power outage that hit all of the Southwest in the middle of June. So heat in the Southwest is, the way we're thinking about it from the assessment perspective, is this intersection of acute events, so these extreme events that might happen, as well as the underlying conditions. And the social vulnerability, the demographic patterns, that expectation of heat that we have cultivated in the Southwest. An extreme event that can amplify an existing event, but also deals with some of these accumulated vulnerabilities. Okay, so this has caused us, or this, in the process of this project, this points actually towards the social vulnerability project that will be going on later on in the CLIMAS portfolio. But thinking about how we're discussing vulnerability and resilience. And a few of the key themes that came out as part of this assessment was this intersection between extreme events and persistent conditions that I've already discussed, and how the impacts can be amplified by social and environmental gradients. So household economics, vocational exposure. Do you work outside? Do you have alternative transportation options in a high heat event? And so it's not simply exposure, but it's also how you're exposed or the reasons why you might be exposed. And I think these are all really key issues. The NIDIS project is probably trying to, I mean, these are really difficult problems, so it's not to suggest that these are easy to think through. And so resilience is moving beyond single measures of adaptive capacity. So if it's exposure during transportation systems, it might be as simple as building bus stops, but not to think that would necessarily fix all of the problems. If we focus on a more system level or holistic assessment of these acute extremes and persistent vulnerabilities when targeting heat. Okay, so a few of the challenges, conclusions, and lessons learned, and then I'll get to the fun stuff of the new projects that are going forward. One, in terms of challenges moving forward, was just this difficulty in identifying the underlying vulnerabilities. Extreme heat, especially very warm days, are relatively easy to track because you can just literally look at the temperature on the thermometer and say it's an extreme heat day. The way that some of these underlying vulnerabilities affect people's experience is harder to assess, and so it's harder to develop interventions that address those. So, you know, have behavioral modification of, you know, cooling center. Obviously, I think some of the folks in ASU have discussed, like, the question of access, the inability to reach some of those cooling centers on some of the extreme heat days, or some of the policy and planning that might address some of the vulnerabilities in short and long-term time scale. And I've used this graphic a few times. It's a little blocking now, but even just the Tucson, this is a very unfun bus stop seeing the sun versus the slightly less unfun in July bus stop covered. So small things that can be done that help mitigate some of these exposures. A few other challenges moving forward is this tension between how you think about emergency management perspective on heat and triaging those extreme events, and then the long-term planning. So thinking about sustainability on a longer time frame. And I think that there's room to do both, and obviously an integrated approach that looks at both is really, I think, where we're headed with this. But it recognizes that these decision contexts span multiple scales of governance and multiple time scales. And so the challenge of dealing with heat and heat-related vulnerability, you have the immediate effect of every heat season. There's exposure to extreme heats, as Greg and Sarah very clearly articulated. But there's also the long-term planning considerations that might help mitigate exposure to heat at a longer-term time scale. And that's, I think, where a few of the projects that I can talk about. Actually, I'm just going to skip this. So a few of the projects that I think have helped grapple with this a little bit or have integrated this perspective. One is the collaboration we had with TP, and there were a lot of the things that came out of that project. But one of the key things is the shifting seasonality of temperatures in terms of spring into summer, and earlier spring or earlier summer temperatures occurring earlier. So we have increased extreme heat, but we also have changing seasonality. So we have a longer warm period as well as warmer extreme temperatures. And so this leads to two ways to think about this type of vulnerability in the context of this change. One is the acute vulnerability of increased daily peak load, the potential for service interruptions, and then rolling blackouts. And this is actually a screen cap from Sperry, which is a little home grid here at Atmo produces as part of their power load forecasting. But it actually captures one of the power outages we had in Tucson. I think this was June 16th of last year. This little dip, it's really small on the graph. This little dip is when there was a small scale power outage because demand was so high. This was one of the warmest days last June. And so understanding how that could have been a much bigger dip if the power outage had been more widespread. But thinking through how there are these acute effects of extreme heat in terms of how we use power, but then also thinking at the longer term scale of that persistent vulnerability. So it's not just that the power might go out in the summer, there's also the changing economics of utility bills. So if it's warmer, if the summer's longer, you're gonna have to pay for your cooling. If you have the ability to pay for your cooling systems, it's gonna be more expensive to run those as spring becomes warmer earlier. So longer, warmer summers mean probably higher cooling bills over that time period. Another CLIMAS project, this is actually led by Lad Keith, but I think is a really nice way of thinking about that longer term perspective. It's thinking about how you can connect that acute issue of urban heat islands versus the long-term planning and policy considerations that might grapple with it. And again, this goes back to the balance of thinking about the implications for the everyday or the day-to-day experience. I think your example of walking down the street and having those brick walls, kicking the heat back off of you and making it almost unbearable, versus when would you have had to make a decision about planning and policy in order to mitigate that? I mean, Lad, I think it's probably 20 years ago, something like that. And so the question is, how can we think about 20 years from now? What are the decisions we can be making now that can integrate? I think that's one of the real strengths of Lad's project, is bringing that long-term perspective into how we're thinking about mitigating exposure to heat in both the short and the long-term time frame. And then finally, a Haury project that I'm doing as part of my faculty fellowship, which is thinking about heat and the relationship to air quality. And we're not trying to reinvent air quality monitoring because the EPA has that much more detailed and precise instruments, but it's focusing on how we can think about citizen science-based environmental monitoring to think about how temperature and air quality are related. So with nitrogen oxides and ozone and the relationship to temperature, and also concerns about drought and particulate matter. And it's really starting with the collaboration with the community network in the Ambos Nogales region. And the focus is on how community-based environmental air quality monitoring can be a focal or an entry point into discussions about climate-related vulnerabilities. So what's the role of air quality? What's the role of some of the development decisions that have been made or lack of development decisions that have been made? Deforestation or devegetation, the expansion of colonias and some of the undeveloped or some of the unplanned colonia development in the region. And really it's connecting the idea of daily exposure for nitrogen oxides, ozone, particulate matter, with some of those long-term patterns of temperature, urban development, and loss of vegetation in the borderlands region. With that, I think I'm going to stop because I'm at 15 minutes. I do want to make special thanks to Emery Eves, who made substantial contributions to the assessment project, and also to Andrea Ladd and Diane for their past, present collaboration on the projects that I mentioned. Yeah.
Individual homeowners can do a lot to be prepared. I catch water off my roof. I have 5,600 gallons in capacity in storage tank. It fills up in the monsoon. I use the sunlight to recharge batteries. In other words, my net generation of electricity exceeds what I use. I'm putting it back in the grid and my batteries stay fully charged in case there's a complete power outage. The batteries are costly, but nonetheless, this is what individual homeowners can do to be prepared in case there is a real crisis.
Well, it highlights the really the innovation. So if we've had broad investment in the larger, the ways we grapple with living in the Southwest, I think some of those household level ones identify different ways that we can, at a household scale, and then the question becomes, do we have enough people who have access to the resources to implement those kind of changes that highlight some of the, because it'll work best if lots of us are doing it. If just it's you, then it's great for you. Then your neighbors probably don't benefit. So the idea is, how can we get to that, citywide or neighborhood-wide investment in this type of
That's right. People have different priorities.
Yeah. It's a great example.
It also seems like, we have to work at these multiple levels at the regional, local, neighborhood, or individual house level.
Yeah, I think a recognition of, oh, sorry.
Yeah, no, so it's what you got.
Oh no, I think that recognition of the different timescales or the different ways where projects or ongoing collaborations can intervene is such a strong word, but participate with people in issues that are a concern to them. And some are very clearly well designed for a broad, overarching, like a federal level intervention program, and others, grassroots level community development may be the better model. But I'm going to decide that's what you're trying to tell me before I interrupt you.
We need it all.
Yeah.
There's a group in Tucson called Physicians for Social Responsibility that will go to neighborhoods and help them organize in case the power goes out and how to keep everybody in the neighborhood surviving. And the one who coordinates all that is at home in her pajamas watching this right now.
I think she's on the call, yeah. Barbara.
Yeah.
Yeah, Dan.
I'm not sure if this is a question, I'm not sure what it is, but it occurred to me, I wrote down, Heidi mentioned that vector control collects data, but it isn't yet useful for the work that they're doing. Sarah mentioned the surveillance problem with heat impacts. That is to say that, and Vince kind of puts the details in there, that maybe it's not being tracked particularly well, although it's there. It's this analogy was a puzzle to put together yet. And in a sense, what you're talking about, there's gradations between these things where there's data out there, and it may be in a sector that's not a scientific sector that we're working in. So maybe emergency management or whatever. But it occurs to me that this is a really interesting theme, which is that if we're going to do this kind of work, then we have to try to integrate these data and information sets in some kind of sensible way. Because Heidi to improve the modeling and projection of mosquito and so forth. Obviously, they could use that vector control information, the same as heat. And I don't have anything to say about it. It's just, it strikes me as really interesting that we're having this. I like Vince's puzzle thing. It's like some of these things, your acute chronic things, without thinking about it, it's like some of these things, the little things might help. The batteries in my house, but it's going to help him, right? Like, the bigger thing is how do you put the pieces together? And it feels like there's a big data piece of this.
Yeah, I think there's definitely some data that's missing. There's also, maybe there's data out there that we don't know or we haven't connected yet. And it'd be easy to say, we have to think about poverty or economics. Clearly we do, but the process of integrating that in some of these questions is actually really challenging because poverty and inequality affects lots of things. And so it's not just heat exposure or investment in the technologies. So,
Some of it's just like understanding where this data lives, though.
Well, so,
and what's missing, and if you can figure out a way to get it if it is missing.
so if we look next door to California, we can see the future of what we need to do here because they've made investments in trying to do that kind of data coordination.
Just like integrate or just even identify it.
Right, and making sure that it's collected. You know, so it's got to be a little bit top down.
Yeah, sure.
Andrew, I'm gonna take it forever.
So the problem you're describing is exactly what we had in mosquito data, where it's expensive to go trap mosquitoes, and it's destructive sampling too, so it doesn't help the science. If you sample the same backyard every night, you're killing half the mosquitoes in the backyard, so you don't know how many mosquitoes there would have been in the first place, right? And so between that and the fact that it's really expensive, it's by its nature always going to be spotty. We're never going to have like climate data quality information about mosquitoes, or will we have about interventions or heat deaths logged by ICD-10 or 11 or whatever we're on now in hospitals, because the person who dies from heat dies from a heart attack or something else, COPD, and that's what's going to get coded, and we'll address that problem, but it's never going to fix it. That's why we made a model. So we have enough spotty data and enough understanding of basic processes to say, we're never going to collect the data. Let's make a really good model that we can validate in bits and pieces, and that fills in all the blanks. And I would say the answer to this problem you just talked about is that we could assemble some parts rough, some parts pretty good models of what would happen if you switch the electricity off for 3 days, or water went out after the first day, or whatever it is, and actually run those cascades and literally see who and who the vulnerable populations are and what you might do. I think there's an opportunity to do a lot of modeling there, and that fills in the blanks. And every time you get a little surge in some new data set, you can say, "Ooh, can we improve the model this way and update it?" But that was literally the driving force 15 years ago behind creating the mosquito model, was for exactly that reason. We just knew, you're never gonna get a good enough data. You're gonna have to actually invent your data. And actually, even the climate change models are much the same. In the end, you can measure climate as much as you want, but you're not gonna know until you actually integrate the whole system. So I think that's where this field is gonna go.
And then I'll just add that much like say California is doing it, so the world of public health, you can add also onto that it's private data, right? So those kind of data don't get out there and they get treated very differently. And yes, what I die of on my death certificate is different, like everything else that was part of it. But people are recognizing it, and they are trying to kind of integrate and start to speak about that. I know that H.E.A.T is doing a lot with vector control, that they're trying to get people to talk, but everybody does it differently. There's no standard on that, and those kind of issues. And then the reason that the physician fills out the death certificate is not so that you and I can collect this data.
We did learn from our partners there an idea that came across was the emergency management side, right? So the first responders, they mark heat. And then when it gets to the hospital, that might change based on what the illness is or how they die and such. So maybe it's going a step higher or earlier in the process and trying to get that data from them. The call is someone had heat exposure.
It's just for these big problems like the adventures are teaching. It's like, how do you even get your fingers around?
Right.
Yeah. What's actually happening?
Go ahead.
I'm actually, not for me, for Barbara. Barbara actually brought up citizen activists like ours, and this is where you can leverage some of those community networks, but actually benefit from ideas about what data can be collected. So if you have activist communities or citizen scientists, or RainLog is great, right? It gathers a bunch of information about rainfall distribution. It's not perfect, but it's pretty good. And so comparing that to the Tucson station is a nice way to look at the variety of that rainfall.
Yeah, maybe a little bit harder to do though with morbidity data.
You just think about how you
But on the other hand, we know that the Commission for Environmental Cooperation between Canada, U.S., and Mexico is investing in pilot projects for syndromic surveillance of extreme heat. And Arizona is going to, at least it was in their plan, that Arizona is going to be one of the states they look at, and then Chihuahua is going to be another one. So we feel that'll help us connect our nascent network here. So
I was wondering, related to heat, if maybe Pima County's, the length of our border next to Mexico influences the number of heat-related deaths we get from immigrants crossing. That might not be the case for other counties that don't have that long a border with Mexico.
Yeah,
So when the question is that there's more deaths because we have a longer border.
Migrant deaths.
Yeah, I wonder if that influences the number of heat-related deaths that we get in Pima County just because of the length of the border.
ADHS has some kind of fascinating graphs of just that, kind of where the deaths happen in Maricopa, which is all in Phoenix, and where the deaths happen in Pima County, and it's that distinction.
They also have it broken down by, so deaths that happen in Arizona and deaths that happen in Arizona to people who are from Arizona versus someplace else. So that's another. I think you're right when you look at how they parse the deaths related to heat data. We still got, it looks like there still are, right? They're here. We should probably figure out how to reduce that, but it's a separate, it's very additional, it's a separate, more complicated set of issues.
I just wanted to make a note that there is a national syndromic surveillance program called Essence, and Arizona has a good, it's a pretty robust system in calculating heat-related illness throughout the state. And the only problem is that it's dependent on which hospitals are involved in the system. So the more hospitals you get, the more data you can actually acquire. But the thing that you were talking about, Greg, they have done it, and they are utilizing the data. And I think it's through the ISDS, remember, International Society for Disease Surveillance, I think. So they get funding through there to do HRI surveillance throughout the state.
And that kind of metadata is what really can be helpful. And I think to add to the puzzle thing, I think it's a multi-dimensional puzzle as the number of dimensions goes to infinity. We know that by not we don't concern ourselves with who died, what their personal details are, but the metadata about the number of deaths and the change in daily deaths. And those things, it turns out that there's an Italian group that did some research on Twitter feeds, looking for words like grandma heat stroke or some combination of words like that in Twitter feeds. And they were able to get hour by hour updates on heat health indicators that could be useful. So this puzzle is coming together in ways we still barely know. The citizen science stuff with Airstream and air casting. I guess there's a citizen science network where people are carrying around PM 2.5 or less particle detectors, and there's people wearing Fitbit wristband. They can tell you if the person's hot and suffering from extreme heat. And these are things that weren't available even 5 years ago. So that we're ripe for the kind of integration that you were talking about. Could pull this stuff together from all the different fields and provide it in a useful and timely way to the first responders, because they can't take all that data. They wouldn't be able to take it. They need specific data that can help them action the ways.
I would like to, may I have the last word?
Yeah.
Thank you, Ben, for organizing this.
Yeah.